Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here for videocopilot.net, and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at creating some advanced electricity effects inside of After Effects. This one's going to be a lot of fun, so let's go and take a look at what we're going to be creating. All right, so there's a lot of cool things we're going to be exploring and a lot of different techniques that we're going to be combining together. So let's go and take a look at a few of the different setups. So here I have an example where the lightning is reflecting off of the surface, and each time it touches the ground, it's creating sort of an interactive contact point. So we're going to take a look at setting up the look of the lightning, and we're also going to be taking a look at tips to make the lightning look more organic and integrated and create a really nice soft glow. And the cool thing about this is that it's dynamic, so we don't have to custom draw any of the reflections. And as you can see in this example, same kind of thing, but what I can do is I can open up the comp with my lightning, and just to show you really quickly, I can go to one of the lightning effects, change the color, and it will update in the final comp, and you can actually play it back and the color of the reflection changes. So it's very dynamic and works really well. All right, go and close that. Another quick tip we're going to look at is using the source material to influence the reflection. So you can see in this example, we're actually using some of the texture from the original plate to influence the reflection's intensity. So I'll show you some cool tips for controlling that. So here you can kind of see how it's interacting with the background. I think electricity effects are really cool. You see them in a lot of great movies. You see that scene in Back to the Future. The electricity is traveling down the line and, like kills that kid. That's one of Steven Spielberg's best movies. Really like that movie. Now, another really cool example is creating this subsurface scattering effect for the clouds. And this is a really fun and really powerful technique, so definitely pay attention to this one. And then we're also going to take a look at adding some electrical effects to a text or to a logo, and you can see that it interacts with the contours in a really nice, realistic way. So take a look at that. And then finally, we're going to be taking a look at this technique where we can actually control the direction of the lightning. In this case, we're going to have like a reverse gravity effect. So this is a really cool technique for giving your lightning a direction. All right, so we've got a lot of fun stuff to do. And of course, I'll try to keep my electrical puns to a minimum. Now, I will admit, I went on Google and I did a search for electrical puns. And I got to say, there was a shocking number of results. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Now, first thing that we want to do is set the project file to 32 bits per channel. So if you hold down Alt, you can cycle through 8, 16, and 32 bits. This will just give us more color information when working with bright, glowing type of effects. All right, so let's take our street sidewalk footage, drop it into a new comp, and let's create a new solid. We'll call this lightning. Hit OK. And then we're going to add the advanced lightning effect. So we could come over here to the effects and presets. We could type in lightning, scroll down to advanced lighting, and drop that on here. Now, quick side note, at Video Copilot, we've developed a free tool called Effects Console that allows you to apply effects to layers a little bit quicker. So I'm going to delete this, and using the Effects Console that you can download for free, link in the description, I'm going to hit Control Space, and we're going to type in lightning. and then I can hit enter, and it works just like that. So you can use the effects preset window still, but throughout the tutorial, I'll probably be using Effects Console. Now, first thing I'm going to do is go to the glow settings and turn the opacity down to 0. I'm not a big fan of the glow, and we're going to be creating our own glow a little bit later. So let's focus on the core. Now, let's turn the core radius up to maybe 3, make it a little bit thicker. Now remember, we want the lightning to hit on the ground. So what I can do is take the rectangle mask tool and just draw a shape around the bottom. So if I turn this off, you can actually see that I've isolated this bottom part. And the cool thing is that the lightning effect can actually interact with it. So what we can do is go to the alpha obstacle and just turn this up a bit. And now you can see that it's sort of touching the surface. So we could bring this down here. Now I can hit Control-Shift-H, and that will hide the controllers or the masks. I can also just turn off the masks right here, and I can move this around. But if I move it too far one way, it actually stretches off the layer. So what I can do is go down to the expert settings, and we have a setting called termination threshold. So if we turn that down to about 5%, and we can see that it actually cuts off those extra points. And this way we have a perfect contact of our lightning. Now, there's a few other cool settings here. Things like decay, and we can turn on decay main core. And this is a cool setting for varying the thickness a bit. We can also play around with the forking. I like to play with the turbulence and turn it down a bit. It becomes more straight, and you turn it up, it gets really complex. So about right there, maybe turn up a little bit of branching. Now, another cool thing I like to do is add some animation to the core radius. So we could keyframe it, or we could add a quick expression. So I'm just gonna add a wiggle expression. So I'll alt-click on the stopwatch next to the core radius, and we can come down here and we can type in an expression. We'll do wiggle 7, maybe 3. And what this says is that 7 times a second, we want to randomly change the value by a factor of 3. So this will just give the core, if we look closely here, just a little bit of variation. Now, there's another setting here called the conductivity. So as I move this, it sort of undulates the electrical current. Now, what we can do is alt-click on that stopwatch and add another expression. So this time we'll use the time expression, so time, star for times, and maybe 2. And this will just multiply time times 2 and slowly change it as it goes. Now there's a lot of detail here. Maybe I'll turn the forking down just a little bit. And maybe turn the decay down. Like I like for them to touch down on the ground. So that looks nice. Now, the other thing we could do is actually animate the direction. Now, I should quickly point out, if you play around with the types, you can actually create some slightly different looks. Breaking kind of creates some interesting sort of patterns, and there's some other interesting ones. So play around with that. We'll probably just stick to direction for now. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Maybe we could just add a little bit of movement to the direction, set a keyframe, and just move it a little bit. And of course, you can play around with the different settings as well. The core drain will create some interesting variation, and the fork variation as well. So a lot of cool settings here that don't usually get explored enough. All right, so we've got this. Maybe we'll turn up the core radius just a bit. All right, so this is a great start. Now we can actually try to make it look good. So what we can do is pre-compose the lightning layer. So we'll choose Layer, Pre-compose, Move All Attributes, and we'll call this Lightning Comp, and hit OK. Now, one thing we should probably do is if we double click on it, we can open it up. And let's set the core color to maybe a blue setting. And we can hit Tab and use the left arrow to go back. or just go back to the comp. All right, so now let's go ahead and create that nice reflection. Now, if we look back at the original example, you can see that the reflection contacts and there's some nice specular highlights, and it's all procedural. So it moves as the lightning moves. All right, so let's start by creating a specular reflection. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate the layer, Control D or Edit, Duplicate, and then I'm gonna solo that layer. And then we're gonna add the linear wipe effect. Now I can search for it or I can just type it in, linear wipe. And what this effect does is essentially just, it's like a transition effect. So let's just set this to 180. And what I wanna do, and if I hold down Control as I move it, it'll move slower, is I wanna just isolate the very bottom of this effect. Just like that. And that way I've created a highlight of exactly where the lightning contacts the ground. And now I'm gonna add a blur. So we're gonna add a box blur, which is the latest and greatest in the current version of After Effects, and it's called the fast box blur. And I'm gonna set the blur to horizontal and increase the blur radius. And then I'm gonna add another fast box blur. And by the way, you can right click, add to favorites, and that way it shows up at the top. And this time I'm gonna do a vertical blur. So I'll turn that up. Now, here's the thing about a blur. If I blur it too much, it fades out entirely. So what I wanna do is add a solid composite. Right now, the background is transparent. So I'm gonna add a solid composite. So it's called solid composite. Add that, set it to black, and you can faintly see our glow or our blur right now. But on top of that, I'm gonna add an exposure effect. So we'll type exposure, hit enter. And now with the exposure effect, I can turn this up really bright. And this is the nice thing about working in 32 bits per channel, is that you have more flexibility and color accuracy. So now if I turn up this vertical blur, I can create a nice streak. Now, if you use a solid composite, you no longer have an alpha channel. So let's set this to additive and then turn on our lightning layer. So now we can actually see what they look like together. But what I want to do is cut off the top part of this blur. And I can do that by adding another linear wipe. So we could type in linear wipe, set this to 180 again, and bring the completion down. And then turn up the feather just a little bit. And this way we give it a little bit of dimension. We can check this out now, and we've got something going on. All right, so this is a really good start. Now, I want to start introducing a nice texture into this effect as well. So if we go to the project, I've got this grunge texture here, and we could drop this into our scene. Maybe right on top of the lightning. Maybe we'll hit return and we'll call this spec. Now, if we turn on our background plate or just unsolo all the layers, things are looking pretty good, but the only problem with this is that it looks too smooth. So we want to add a little bit of texture. So that's what this texture is for. So if we turn this on, maybe what we'll do is make it a 3D layer, and we'll rotate it and just try to align it to the surface a bit. We could hit S and scale it up. Now, I could probably do a 3D camera track on the background, but let's focus on the lightning stuff, and let's just go time and freeze frame, and we'll just work off a still frame for now. So I'll turn the texture on, and I'm gonna pre-compose this. So I'm gonna choose Layer Pre-Compose, move all the attributes, and we're just gonna call this Ground Texture, and hit OK. Now I'm gonna toggle the switches, and we're gonna take this lightning specular layer and set this to Luma Matte. Now if you look closely, the texture is now affecting that specular highlight. All right, so we've got the first one done. Now what we could do is maybe we'll color code this. So we'll just change this to red and the texture to green. And that will be a little easier to see. And so what I'm going to do is select these two and choose Edit, Duplicate. And now I'll take this bottom copy and I want to blur it out even more. So I'm going to go to the Fast Box Blur, the horizontal. I'm going to increase that. And I'm going to turn up the exposure. And I'm going to increase the vertical as well. So what we're doing is creating more of a diffused reflection area. And the whole trick to this is really trying to recreate what happens in reality, where you have a really bright spot with the specular highlights, and then you have a more diffused, softer area around it. Okay, so we'll turn the background on so we can see this in context. And this bottom one, we'll call this diffuse, and maybe turn it up a bit more. And again, we can soften the linear wipe at the end just to create a more three-dimensional look. All right, so this looks pretty good, but we're also going to need a couple more. We need a really hot spot for the contact. So let's take the specular and texture and duplicate it, Control D, and we'll call this point. And this is going to be just a little bit of a soft point around the contact. So what we'll do is, let's see, we'll turn the vertical one down and turn the side one up a bit. And then we can turn the exposure down. This is sort of how we control it. So very roughly, we can see what's going on here, and maybe turn the intensity down a bit. And we could add a little bit of vertical. But that looks nice. And maybe even take the specular, and you could turn the opacity down on them now. And that's an easy way to mix it in addition to using the exposure effects. So that's pretty good. Maybe we'll want to have like a little bit of a contact point. So we could do even one more copy, Control D. And this time we'll keep the blur really, really small. And we can, disable the background, and we can see this a little bit better here. And it may seem like a lot of work just for this little reflection, but it really makes a big difference in the realism if you can actually have interaction. Now, if you want it to seem more shiny, you could lower the horizontal blur. And that'll kind of make it look a little shinier, and even turn these two down. So just sort of a matter of playing with the look, and of course looking at real reference. But obviously that looks really nice. And here's the cool thing is if I lock this window, open up the lightning, any one of the lightning comps, slide it over to the side here, close that, is I could go and I can change the color. So we could change this to gold, and everything will update. Come back over here, close that. All right, so we'll turn our background back on. We can even just grab just the lightning comps now. And that's why I like to use the color, because you actually right click on the color and choose select label color, and it'll just select all of those. And I could even just move some of these things up. So I could grab the lightning, move this up, even scale it down if I want to. But I'm not bringing the texture. I'm leaving the texture where it is so that it stays locked to the ground. So that's pretty good. All right, so I think that looks pretty good for our reflection. And as you saw earlier, we can play around and tweak it in a little bit. But now let's take a look at adding the glow to our lightning. So let's take our lightning, bring it up to the top here, and let's set it to additive. All right, so now let's go ahead and start working on the glow effect for our lightning. All right, so here's how I like to work with my illuminated effects. So what I'm going to do is add a solid composite effect and set this to black. Now it's additive, so it shouldn't make a difference. And now we're going to add a glow effect. And what I'm going to do is turn the threshold down to 0 and the intensity down extremely low and the radius to about 25 or 30. And we want it to be really, really, really low. And then we're going to duplicate the glow. And we'll increase the radius because we want to really have a nice soft glow. So we'll increase the radius about 100 or so. And then one more time we'll hit Control D and duplicate it. So now we've got 3 glow effects stacked on. We can increase that a bit. Now it's not making that big of a difference. So what I'm going to do is add an exposure effect now. And now I can increase the exposure effect. And this will create a nicer result. So even though it's a little bit slower to have so many stacked effects, you can actually get a much softer looking glow. Now, the other thing I could do is add a hue and saturation effect. So we'll type in hue and saturation, add that. And maybe before the exposure, I could just turn the saturation down just a touch. And of course, I could probably just do this on the actual lightning effect as well. So I could perhaps go inside of the lightning and maybe change the color to something else like maybe blue, go back. All right, so this is a really great start to creating some nice lightning. Now, I've also included this hotspot element that you can bring in and set this to additive. And this is just kind of fun for creating a source. We could just use curves adjustment to just dim it down or even colorize it. And just link it up. We could link it up to the position, but kind of get the idea. Just kind of cool to see it come from a source. Now, here's a couple of other cool things. So again, now that you see the glow and you start to understand the intensity of this lightning effect, you might think about playing around with your specular highlight effect a bit. And it doesn't seem as crazy to have such a large area of light. Maybe diffuse that a bit. You know, here's one more cool trick. Again, it's all about the combination of effects, but there's an effect called turbulent displace. And if you switch this to horizontal displacement, kind of creates this side to side movement. Well, what you can do is turn the size down to 0. I think it's 2. And then the complexity up to say 2 or 3. And if you increase the amount, you see that? It creates like just a little bit of displacement, just like a little bit of an unevenness, as if the surface were, you know, a little rocky, maybe like 3. And then you can play around with the blur effects. So, but you might think to yourself too, you know, you don't have time to render a turbulent displacement effect, and I understand that too. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's all procedural and it's all being generated from the same lightning layer. So again, we can change the color of the lightning. And the effect is going to update on the other side. It's all about working smarter and more efficiently. You know, I can remember in high school, my parents would ask me to do some yard work, and what I would do is I would pay the neighbor kid to beat me up. And then my parents would see my face and, you know, so I got out of it, at least until the next day. And then I'm out there sweeping the porch with like a black eye and a sprained shoulder. So I bought some time, is what I'm saying. All right, so we've got this lightning effect here. I've changed the color to more of like a gold color. And now I want to show you a couple of different ways to make it look more realistic. So for example, if we select the main lightning effect, here's a couple of cool things that you could add to it. One is a turbulent displace. So just like before, we could turn the size really low, and look at this, it just kind of creates kind of a random noise. And we could maybe put that before the glow effect and just turn it down really low. Just make it look energetic. And this just gives it more texture. Now, on top of that, there's a really cool effect called vector blur. And I think you guys know this effect. It's been overused once or twice by me, I'll admit. But if we can just tone it down a little bit, we might be onto something. Now, we can turn the amount up to about 3 or 4, and maybe the ridge up a bit. So here, let's see if we turn this up high. Okay. And this can be really cool. You can put it after some of the effects. So this is what you don't want, I think. I think if you just kind of give it a little bit. And so that way you still have some hard edges, but there's also some soft edges. And just play around with the order. If we put this before the exposure effect, it's going to change entirely the look of it. But it's also kind of cool if it's before, so you have a little bit more hot spots around the lightning. So just keep it subtle, and even the displacement could be put, say, after. And these two effects actually can kind of work together. So one of them takes the detail away, and the other sort of adds it back. Now, another thing I like to do is add a little bit of randomness to the brightness and flicker it. And so we could actually add a wiggle expression into the exposure, and perhaps wiggle maybe like 7,4. So I don't mind if it gets really bright like that. I just want to make sure it gets bright really fast. So let's set this to like 9 and 3. Yeah, so that's pretty good. Now, one last cool tip for creating a more interactive reflection is to use our source material in our ground texture. So let's take our street footage layer and copy, edit, copy, and then jump inside of the texture. And what we can do is just paste it in here, edit, paste, Control V. And let's set the transfer mode to soft light. And that way it just interacts with it a little bit. And maybe we'll get rid of this. And let's add an exposure effect. And what we want to do is just softly introduce some of the brightness from this texture. I'm kind of looking at the street crosswalk here. And that's pretty good. Let's go back here. And so now it actually changes it just a little bit. So if we turn off the background, you can actually see the way that it's interacting. And what we might do is lock that, open up the texture, slide it over, and just play around with it. If we could add a little more contrast to it. And this kind of makes sense because in some cases the white paint might be a little bit smoother than the ground, and so you just create a little bit more variation, which just helps make it look more realistic. So small thing, but anytime you can introduce your source material into the simulated effects, it's going to look that much better. Now, if you remember the effect from earlier, where it looks almost like the lightning is moving in a direction, sort of a reverse gravity effect here. So there's actually a really interesting and simple way to do this. So if we just go back to our example we created, let's open up the lightning comp. Now, in order to get this to work, what I'm going to do is hit Control R and bring down a guide. And this will tell us where the cutoff point is for our reflection. All right, so to create this directional traveling lightning effect, what we're going to do is create a new solid, and we're going to make it higher than the normal size. So we're going to make it, say, 2048. And that's because we want it to move vertically, so I'm going to add more to the height. But if I wanted to move side to side, I can make the width higher. So we'll hit OK, hide the old layer, and we're going to add the lightning effect. Turn the glow settings down to 0. And I'm going to move the position of the layer. So I'll hit P, set a keyframe for the position. I'm also going to set a keyframe for the origin and the direction. And the idea here is I'll move this up. And then I'll take these 2 points. We'll move this one here and we'll move this point just somewhere where we can track. So maybe about right there, in between these 2 points. Now, because we want this to interact with an alpha channel, I'm also going to create a mask. So we'll create a mask right at the same point as our other one. And we'll go to the alpha obstacle, crank that up. That looks good. And I'm also going to hit M for the mask path and set a keyframe. Okay. So now if I select the layer, hit U, I should have 4 keyframes. So I have the path for the mask, the origin and direction, and the position of the layer. So what I'm going to do is first, let's set the mask down to none just so we can see the size of the layer. Otherwise, it hides that. So if we just turn it off, we could see it. We'll move forward, and I'm going to move the layer down. And what we need to do is offset these values back up. So let's move this back up to where it was. Let's move this up, move the mask back up to our cutoff point. So about there. And then we'll turn the mask back on. So now if we look at this, we've created a traveling lightning effect. Now, it might be a little hard to see, so I'll just extend the length of the comp and then just shift these keyframes over. And let's take a look. So you can actually see it's moving down. Now, I could probably lock that position to right there. So let's... So the cool thing is that there is a little bit of movement, but just not too much. You get a feel for the direction of the lightning. Now, we could change the type. Some of these other ones, like strike, are a little bit more stable in the way that they move. We could turn the turbulence down. All the same settings will work and create some different interesting results. We can still play around with the direction as well. So we could have it sort of shifting from side to side, but the start point is still going to stay the same. Now, if you wanted to create this coming out of somebody's hand, you could create a horizontal layer and pretty much do the same thing. So check this out. We'll set the size up to like 4, turn the, that's good. And then we'll set the color to like, I don't know, blue. And then let's take a look. So maybe we just darken down the color a bit. That way we don't have to change all of our look settings. Good. All right, so now let's take a look at what it looks like animating into the ground. So pretty cool. We can select the keyframes and then go up to animation, keyframe assistant, reverse keyframes. And now it will play the other direction. So sort of sucking out of the ground. Execute order 6. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so now at this point, and again, it's nice because all of these parameters can be controlled now through just opacity. So you can tweak the look to kind of go with the color that you've chosen. And all right, so there you have it, directional lightning. All right, so for this next section, we're going to be taking a look at creating the subsurface cloud effect using a lot of really cool tricks. So the idea is that there's a light source that exists behind the clouds, and it's creating this sort of illuminance effect. So what we're going to do is take this plain smoke footage, drop it into a new comp. And this is just very plain footage just to give it a little bit of a texture. Let's first create our light source. So we'll create a new solid, and we'll call this light, hit OK. And we're going to add the lightning effect one more time, at least one more time. And we'll set the opacity of the glow down to 0. Now for this one, I'm going to try the Omni lightning, and this just kind of creates a more sort of sporadic moving lightning. So I think that's kind of cool. Let's animate the conductivity state and just move it around. So I just set a keyframe, hit U. We can see those two keyframes. So just kind of give it a little movement. I'm also going to go to the core settings and add a wiggle expression to the core radius. So like wiggle, I don't know, like 8 and 6. And so what that's going to do is kind of have it blink on and off, right? Maybe we could turn the turbulence down so we decay, and yeah. That's what we're trying to do. We just want to have it kind of flickering and flashing a bit. Might even turn the core radius down, and that way it'll turn off more often. Cool. So let's set the core color to, say, like a gold color. And let's add a solid composite. So solid composite, set that to black. All right, so that's working pretty well. Now I want to go ahead and pre-compose this effect. So I'll choose Layer, Pre-compose. I'll just call this Light Comp and hit OK. Now we're going to add a few effects on top of this. So we're going to add a fast box blur. Now this is kind of the reverse of what we just did. So I actually want to start out with a really wide blur. Now it fades out. So again, we'll boost that with an exposure effect. Okay. Now I want to add back in some of the detail, right? So what I'll do is, maybe I'll lower this down. Nice soft glow. Is I'll do a CC composite on top of this, right? So effect channel, CC composite, set this to additive, right? So we're sort of putting it back on top, and then I'm going to add another box blur. And this one's also pretty soft. Like you see, we're sort of doing an inverse. And I'm also going to take, I'll just add these. I'll do another exposure effect. And then I'm going to do another CC composite. So I'll do channel, composite. We'll set this to add, and we'll add one more box blur. Here we go. So the idea is to kind of create a very diffused looking light source. Unlike the previous sort of scenario. So I'm just playing around with the exposure effects. So something like that. Okay. All right, so this is our lighting effect that we're going to see deep within the clouds. So what I'll do is come over here to the project, and I want to create a mask for the clouds. So what we have is this smoke sprite. So bring this out, and what I can do is duplicate it, set it to lighten, and I can move it off, and so it kind of blends with it. It doesn't make it brighter, and it doesn't make it darker. Just sort of blends with it nicely. And I can rotate this, hit the W key, rotate it, scale it up or down, and duplicate it again. And so we're just going to sort of try to move these pieces around randomly until we fill the entire screen. Now, one thing to note is I want to try to keep some pockets of a dark area. And that way there's bits of sort of occlusion for the light. So let's just distribute this around a bit. And so we do want little areas of dark pockets, right? Okay, so now we're going to take all of these smoke elements, hold down Shift, and we'll select them all, and we'll pre-compose these. Now I'm going to go inside here and I'm going to create an adjustment layer. And here we'll add a curves adjustment. Try that. Okay, so we'll go back. Now we've got this texture. We should probably name this. Let's name this smoke mask. So what we want to do is we want to occlude parts of the light with this texture. So we'll take this light comp and we'll use the set matte effect. And this allows us to select a texture, in this case the smoke texture, and we're going to change the matte. And we'll change the matte from alpha to luminance. So now it looks something like that. Let's click invert. And now let's set this layer to additive. So now if we look at this, we're starting to get a feel for that sort of inverted look. Now let's play with the alpha channel a bit more. Let's add a curves adjustment, switch over to the alpha channel. And maybe we'll add a solid composite on top of this. Channel solid composite. We'll make it black, and now we can color correct it with a curves adjustment. So this just makes it a little easier to color correct it. Or maybe instead of curves, we could just do an exposure effect. Sometimes it's easier to work with exposure when you're dealing with light. So that's pretty nice. I can see a little bit too crisp of an edge, and I might soften that just a bit. But I like the sort of randomness of it. And now we could do a curves adjustment on top of everything and just give it a little bit of gamma, just a little bit more contrast. Of course, we could add a glow effect on top of this. And that will create an even more sort of light scattering type of effect. So pretty cool type of effect. And, we have another tutorial for doing like subsurface skin, uses some of the same principles, but this idea of visualizing the negative space really helps to sell the depth of a shot. And of course, we can now go into the source material for this and potentially, make some changes to this, maybe fill in some of the gaps and things like that. So it feels a little bit more flush together. The other thing is if you change the opacity, you could create a few different depths. So a lower opacity will just create less pockets. And then another interesting thing that we could do is we could take all the layers here, go to the beginning, hit R, set a keyframe for the rotation, go to the end, and just add a little bit of rotation. See that? And now if we watch this, the clouds will almost look like they have a little bit of movement to them. And we could, of course, add other things like turbulent displacement, but I think we've used that enough today. Yeah, not too bad. See, all that crazy glow exposure adjustment doesn't seem so crazy now. All right, and again, in the light comp, I could duplicate this, and I could offset the conductivity so it's random, set it to add. This is a mini tutorial. So sorry for the sidetrack. But I could set this to blue. And then if I go back, you've got the next hot template file available now for 1995. All right, I'm just kidding. All right, so there's obviously way too much information in this one tutorial, so let's go ahead and add a little bit more. We're going to create a new solid, and we're going to call this E3D. So we're going to open up Element, and this is a third-party plugin, but what I want to show you is how you can use Lightning to interact with it. So whether you have a logo or something like that, this is going to be a really cool technique for getting that interactive Lightning. So let's create some text. You'd think I'd have like a preset ready, but here we are. All right, so I'm going to create a text layer. We'll go turn that off. On the Element 3D layer, we'll load up a custom text element of the Video Copilot, and then we'll launch the scene setup. All right, so we're going to create some quick 3D text. Going to click the extrude button, and that's going to load the custom path that we just selected of the logo. And we'll jump over here to the Pro Shaders, Metal, and let's just throw one out here. And sometimes people ask, like, what is Element 3D for? And, well, it's for stuff like this, like creating really cool, fast text. So let's just click on the material, and we can play with the extrusion settings here. And one thing I like to do is double up the extrusion, and then click on the second one, expand the edges, increase the extrusion, and then use like a darker metal color on it, something like that. Now I could go, let's see. All right, that's pretty good. Another thing you could do is select the model and go to the UV settings, and you can increase the repeat. So if you do like 2 by 2, it just will increase the detail. Now this top one, I think that's a little bit too reflective. I want to just do something a little bit more diffuse. And you can also select the materials and edit them. So I can make it more diffused by scrolling down and turning the glossiness down. I think that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to load up a different environment map, maybe just like an outside looking one. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so back to this material. Let's turn the reflectivity down a bit too. And that'll just kind of make it a bit darker. So there we go. Classic metal text logo. Hit OK. There it is. Clean up some of the edges a bit by turning on the enhanced multi-sampling. And then let's create a camera. So do layer new camera. Like a 35 millimeter. And then we'll switch to the camera and move forward. Okay. Now, another thing I'm going to do is turn on the ambient occlusion. So enable that, switch it to ray trace. And that looks pretty nice. Now, to give it kind of a flashy look, I'm going to create a couple of lights. Maybe point lights, and we'll do like, we'll just do some orangish colored lights. And we'll stick them over here, so half res, that's pretty good. And we want these to sort of be flashing kind of on and off. So we could go to the intensity, alt click on the stopwatch, and we'll add an expression, wiggle, maybe like 6 and like 400. Like a lot. And then we just duplicate it a few times. I mean, not too many times, but anyway, you get the idea. You're basically just trying to create a little bit of interactive lighting with the scene. I like to play around with the environment. This is like a big thing for Element, is just being able to shift the reflection to sort of match what you're working on and kind of what you're going for. So, and you can also like animate it. So like slowly animate the reflection, something like that. All right, so now here's a really important sort of workflow tip when you're working with rendered layers. And that's essentially to select the things that make up that element title and pre-compose them. And that way, After Effects will manage the rendering of it more. And once it's rendered, you won't have to keep re-rendering it. And particularly for effects like lightning. All right, I'm going to get rid of some of this blue. I have to. It's too blue. So now, if I want to add some interactive lightning, what I can do now is create a new solid. Call this lightning. And we'll add the advanced lightning effect. So I think I've shown you good ways to create the glow and stuff. So let's talk about how to get it to interact. So what you want to do is we want to set the channel for the alpha from this title. So what we can do is choose Set Matte. And we can select the 3D title. And what that does is takes the alpha channel from the title and replaces it in the solid. And then, of course, the advanced lightning effect will interact with the alpha channel. So we could turn the alpha obstacle up, and now you're getting a nice little bit of movement. Now, the other interesting thing is that this effect also will calculate if the alpha channel is blurred. So check this out. If we add a channel blur, put that above the lightning, and just add a little bit of blurriness, you see how the lightning sort of diffuses in a very cool way. So let's say we set the lightning from directional to a two-way strike, and that way we have 2 points to control. Maybe we set this to like a gold color. Just imagine the beautiful glow that we've created previously. But now we have a great thing where we can animate this across the logo, and we have controls over sort of the softness of it, and now it's going to animate no matter what. So here's another kind of example. Like, let's say we want to animate the characters and do something fun with it. We could go to the multi-object, right? So for every group, there's a multi-object setting. And what this does is sort of breaks every piece down to an individual piece. So we can rotate the Y. So a lot of settings, but once you kind of get the hang of it, we could just do like a cool, slick keyframe that brings the characters kind of into place, or even like a displace. Let's see, like a X displace. Nice. Okay. Then we go back, and because it's the alpha channel, it's going to stay up to date. So all we have to do is animate the origin and the direction. In an interesting way, which is not always obvious. But there's a lot of fun to be had with this. I think this is something that I haven't even really explored enough, but whether it's the alpha obstacle, but then playing around with the, the type of forking and stuff, there's a lot of really cool capabilities with this plugin. So I know this doesn't look amazing, but you kind of get the idea of just essentially having it feel like it interacts, and that just adds so much. Now, in this case, I just put a copy behind the logo just to give it a little bit more depth and feel like it's interacting in the same scene. So sometimes that's a cool trick, is if you want something to feel like it's wrapped around it, have stuff that renders behind it as well. All right, so obviously there's a lot of different things that we can do in different directions that we can take it, and that is where I will leave it for you guys to take some of these different ideas and see what you come up with. I'd love to see some of the different stuff. If you guys want to send it to me, tweet it to me. I always love to see what people are doing with some of these techniques. And as always, combine them with other tutorials, with other ideas, with your own ideas. And let's keep this thing going. Let's not break the circuit. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you learned some cool techniques. And as always, be sure to check us out on videocopilot.net and Instagram, Twitter, all that great stuff. I am Andrew Kramer, and we will see you next time.